All right, let's talk about one of the most famous, most pictured stories in the entire world, the birth of Jesus. It's a story we all think we know, but when you go back to the original texts, well, you might be in for a few surprises. I mean, close your eyes and picture a nativity scene. You see it, right? There's probably a little wooden stable, Mary on a donkey, definitely three kings with fancy crowns. It's an image that's everywhere. But the big question is, how much of that iconic picture is actually in the Bible, and how much have we added over the centuries? So here's how we're gonna break it all down. First, we'll look at the story you know and love. Then, we're gonna fact-check that classic nativity scene. We'll explore the two different gospel accounts, dig into the history and politics of the time, tackle the central miracle of the story, and finally, get to the heart of why this ancient story still means so much to so many people. Okay, first, let's just get that traditional, classic image in our heads, the one we've all grown up with. It's just this perfectly serene scene, isn't it? You've got this humble little barn, some soft hay, a baby practically glowing in a manger. Mary and Joseph are there, of course, surrounded by a cow and sheep. And then, at the exact same moment, both lowly shepherds and super fancy kings show up to say hi. It's a really beautiful picture, but it's basically a composite sketch. So now let's get into what the biblical texts actually say. And you're going to see that a lot of our favorite parts of the story are actually later additions to what is a surprisingly bare-bones account. First up, the journey. We all picture Mary, 9 months pregnant, on the back of a donkey. But the Gospels? They never mention a donkey at all. And honestly, for a woman that close to giving birth, an 80-mile trip would have been brutal. And a bumpy ride on a donkey might have been the absolute worst way to do it. And what about the grumpy innkeeper, the villain of every Christmas play? Well, turns out he's not in the Bible either. The text just says there was no guest room available. The most likely scenario is that they were staying with relatives, and because of the census, the house was packed. The only private space left was probably the lower level of the home, a room where the family might also bring animals in for the night. Now for the three kings. Well, the Bible calls them magi or wise men, not necessarily kings. And it never ever says there were three of them. We just kind of assume that from the three gifts they brought. But the real kicker here is that Matthew's Gospel says they visited Jesus in a house, not a stable, and it could have been up to 2 years after he was born. And finally, get this, the cow, the sheep, all those gentle animals looking on, not a single one is mentioned in Matthew or Luke. Not one. We just assume they were there because Jesus was laid in a manger, which is an animal's feeding trough, but the Bible itself, totally silent on the animals. Okay, so if so much of our traditional story is basically a mashup of later ideas, where does the actual account come from? The answer is it comes from two different books in the New Testament, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and they each tell the story from a totally unique perspective. This table lays it out perfectly, so let's just take a second here. Look at the left column. Matthew's account is all about Joseph's point of view. It's focused on his dreams and how Jesus' birth fulfills Old Testament prophecies, which was super important for his Jewish audience. You see these big, dramatic characters like King Herod and the Magi. Now look over at Luke on the right. His focus is all on Mary. The characters are different. You have Elizabeth and the shepherds, and the themes are all about how this good news is for everyone, especially the poor and the marginalized. So you see, they're not contradictory. They're more like two different witnesses describing the same incredible event from their own unique angles. Luke's version is probably the one we're most familiar with. He's the one who gives us the whole political backdrop with Caesar's census. He details that long, hard journey. He really leans into the humility of the whole situation, and he makes a huge point that the very first birth announcement went not to powerful people in a palace, but to a bunch of shepherds who were basically social outcasts at the time. So you might wonder, how did Luke's account get so personal, so focused on what Mary was thinking and feeling? Well, a very early church tradition suggests that Luke, who is a meticulous historian, might have actually interviewed Mary herself. And that would totally explain why he includes these intimate details, like Mary pondering these things in her heart, that nobody else could have possibly known. So why all the trouble? Why this grueling 80-mile journey for a woman who is 9 months pregnant? Why did it absolutely have to be in Bethlehem, a town so tiny it was basically a rounding error? The answer is this incredible collision of prophecy, politics, and divine timing. The whole story really begins right here. 700 years. That's how long before Jesus was even born that a prophet named Micah foretold the exact little town where the Messiah would come from. Not the big, important capital city of Jerusalem, but tiny, overlooked Bethlehem. Now watch how this plays out. It's wild. You have this incredibly powerful Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus, a guy who probably thought of himself as a god, and he issues an order for his own greedy reason. He wants to count everyone so he can tax them more effectively. This political move forces Joseph and Mary to make that difficult journey. And in doing so, this pagan emperor unwittingly becomes a pawn in a much larger story, perfectly positioning them in Bethlehem at the exact right moment to fulfill that 700-year-old prophecy. It's a huge theme in the text. Human history is being woven into a divine plan. And here it is, the prophecy itself. It's just a stunning piece of history. The point being made is that the biggest plans can start in the smallest places, and even the most powerful rulers on earth can end up serving a purpose they never, ever intended. Okay, so we've deconstructed the scene, we've rebuilt the historical context, but now we have to talk about the central miracle at the very heart of the entire story, the virgin birth. First, let's just be super clear on our terms, because this is a really common point of confusion. The virgin birth refers specifically and only to the conception of Jesus. It's a totally separate idea from the Immaculate Conception, which is a Catholic doctrine about Mary's own conception. For what we're talking about today, we are focused only on the birth of Jesus. And here's the crucial point. According to Christian theology, the virgin birth is really the mechanism for an even bigger miracle. The main event, the real showstopper, is what's called the incarnation, the belief that God actually became a human being. The story isn't just about a special baby, it's the story of how the divine entered into humanity. But what about the biology of it all? A lot of people just dismiss this as impossible, but it's interesting, some sources in the world of faith and science have explored this. They point to a natural phenomenon called parthenogenesis, which is basically a virgin birth, where an egg develops without fertilization. You see it in some reptiles and insects. Now, it is so important to understand the point here. Nobody is trying to give a natural explanation for what is presented as a supernatural event. The idea, as one geneticist put it, is simply to reduce the assumption of incredibility. The claim in the Bible is still a miracle, an act of God, but the basic concept isn't seen as completely biologically absurd. So, after we strip away all the centuries of tradition and the Christmas card imagery and look at the bare text, what are we left with? Why does the story, in its original form, still resonate so powerfully? Well, when you piece together the details from Matthew and Luke, a really clear picture emerges. It's a story about ancient prophecy being fulfilled against all odds. It's a story where salvation doesn't arrive in a palace with power and wealth, but in the most humble, messy circumstances imaginable. And it's a story where the best news in the world is first given not to the important people, but to the forgotten and the overlooked. This line from a classic hymn just captures the whole theological point perfectly. The purpose of the incarnation, according to the sources, wasn't just about a baby being born. It was about making a totally new kind of life, a spiritual second birth, possible for everyone by bridging that gap between God and humanity. So when you peel back all those layers of tradition, you find a story that's actually simpler, more raw, and in many ways, way more profound. It's a story about humility, about prophecy, and about a grand plan unfolding in the most unexpected of places. So knowing the story behind the story, what does it all mean to you?